I begin this webinar by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the lands on which we meet. I acknowledge our gratitude that we share these lands today, our sorrow for the costs of that sharing, and our hope that we can move in unity to an Australia that is fair and just for all its Indigenous peoples. And I'll say the YCW prayer, which is very much a worker's prayer. Lord Jesus, a worker like me, help me and all my fellow workers to think like you, to work with you, to pray through you, to live in you, to give you all my strength and all my time. May your kingdom come in all our factories, farms, workshops and offices, and in all our homes. Be everywhere better known, better loved, better served. Deliver us forever from injustice and hatred, from evil and sin. May our souls remain in your grace today, and may the soul of every worker who died on Labor's battlefield rest in peace. Amen. Well, Stefan needs no introduction in our circles. Suffice to say that he has had a long and close association with the YCW and the Cardijn movements through all his adult life. He's become an expert and a leading authority on the history, methodology and theology of the Cardijn-based movements in Australia and internationally. Stefan has kept the flame burning, a flame that has been so important in the lives of the many who have been transformed by the YCW, the YCS and other similar movements. We owe a lot to Stefan for his commitment to and work for the Cardijn movements and his promotion of Vatican II's teaching on the lay apostolate. I look forward to the presentation tonight. Over to you, Stefan.
Thank you very much, Brian. I'll start by sharing my screen with my presentation on it. Can you see? Yes, it should be coming now. Slideshow mode. Great. Thank you very much to everybody for joining. Yes, I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to speak about Leon Olle Laprune. If you're like me, you've probably never heard of the guy, and I'd never heard of him till just nearly 30 years ago, I'm afraid to say, when I first started researching Cardijn's life. And I found a small document, just one page, which set out his reading, the reading at different periods of his life. And he started in the minor seminary reading a priest called Felicity de Laprune and his followers, a very important person who actually is very relevant to this talk as a background influence. And that was even in the minor seminary. When he went to the seminary, the major seminary, he began to read this guy called Olle Laprune. I had no idea who Olle Laprune was, and there was not much internet around in those days. So it took me a while to start to find some books and learn really about who this man was and why he was so important to Cardijn. And I suppose the reason why I want to remember him particularly this year is because he died in 1898, aged only 58. And so this year is the 125th anniversary of his death. So I'd just like to tell you a bit about his life in different stages and also the influence and the legacy that he's left. He was born in February 1839 in Paris. I believe his father was a landowner, so I guess quite a bourgeois family. He went to a high school called the Lycée Condorcet. Not many people went to high school in those days, but he was surely a very frontline student, because in 1858 he was admitted to what's called the École Normale Supérieure, one of the grandes écoles, as they call them here in France, kind of higher than a university. I'll speak about that in a moment. But there he graduated in letters, which means in those days Greek and Latin and other aspects of philosophy. And as a result of that, he actually got his higher degree in philosophy in 1862 and began to teach philosophy at high school level in a series of cities around France. He really almost made a tour of France, from Nice in the south to Douai in the north, arriving back in Versailles, and finally he got back to Paris in 1871. In 1869, he met a young woman named Marie Adèle Sarranet-Taillandière, who was actually the daughter of a politician and a historian who became a member of the Académie Française, so actually quite a high-level academic. Unfortunately, I don't have a photo of Marie Adèle, so I've just posted for you, for the lack of anything else, the photo of her father, which at least gives you an idea of the milieu into which Olle Laprune was born and in which he grew up and lived. They married in 1872 and had 2 children. Found nothing about his daughter, Renee. His son, Joseph, became known. Actually, he worked in the French embassy to the Vatican and then went to war in World War I and was killed on the battlefield. Apparently an extremely brave soldier. That's some family background. One last piece of it, which is just kind of a little bit of interest. I guess they must have paid well in high schools in those days, or his father, who was a landowner, yes, must have had a bit of property. So they built a family chateau down near Pau, down in the south of France, where apparently he used to go to write his books, about which we'll speak in a minute. Recently, it's been turned into a bed and breakfast, so you can actually stay there. And on the website there, it says actually that Olle Laprune was actually a friend of Gustave Eiffel of Eiffel Tower fame, but I haven't been able to trace any more details of that. Now I'd like to get into the influences on Olle Laprune's intellectual life. And as I mentioned, he went to the École Normale Supérieure, very small classes, as you can see from that class photo in 1858. It's the only other photo I've found of him in that class group there. And it's got a number of interesting people there who are not well known outside of France. But the one that possibly is a little bit known to those who are familiar with Charles de Foucauld, if you look at the middle photo, you see Olle Laprune on the left, and on the right is a guy called Henri Houvelin, who was actually a friend of Olle Laprune, or actually a classmate of Olle Laprune in high school. And they must have been very good students together to get admitted to the École Normale Supérieure. But Henri Houvelin became a priest and a confessor, a kind of a curé d'ars, working in Paris, confessing in Paris. And one young guy that he confessed was this kind of person who'd lost his faith called Charles de Foucauld, who we know today as Saint Charles de Foucauld. So you can see the quality of the person that Henri Houvelin must have been. And although I haven't been able to find any more information about it, I kind of suspect that between the two of them, that, well, clearly they had a very positive influence on each other. But really, as I mentioned at the start, the big influences on Olle Laprune were that Laprune school that I mentioned in relation to Cardijn. Laprune, if you want to understand Cardijn in one sentence or 3 words, are the words God and freedom. They were the key words that was the cornerstone of the life and teaching of Laprune. In a sense, I feel you can regard him as a pioneer, precursor of Vatican II. And among his followers were Henry Lacordaire, who became known for relaunching the Dominicans in France. And one of his key themes in the line of Laprune was the idea of reconciling the church with the modern world. So in industrializing France, democratizing France in the 19th century, the idea was, what does the church say to the world in those circumstances? Again, there you can see traces of what will become the line of the Second Vatican Council. And another one who is said to be a great influence on Olle Laprune was Charles de Montalembert, a Catholic politician, but also a lay leader endeavouring to live out his Christian vocation in, well, the political workplace, let's say. So there were 2 early key influences on Olle Laprune. But another one who was also extremely important, I've spoken in other webinars about Alphonse Guthrie, a French theologian and philosopher who we can see as what we know today from Vatican II as reading the signs of the times. And he'd been a chaplain to the École Normale Supérieure, although it was before Olle Laprune was a student there. But the significant thing in this context is that he wrote a small book called Les Sources, in which he proposed a 6-year program of personal study of the sciences and theology. And by sciences, he meant not just physical science, but also, well, as they were then, the emerging social sciences. And this again is in this line of reconciling the church with modern knowledge, the modern world that was emerging. Now, in 1862, we've even got a date for it because he marked it in his diary. Leon Olle Laprune decided to take up that commitment of 6 years, committing himself to 2 hours personal study per day to follow the program set out by Alphonse Guthrie. And he actually followed that. And it's very interesting to see the outcome of that. In 1869, he doesn't exactly say that this was the outcome of his 6 years of study, but at the end of his 6 years of study, in 1869, he adopts specifically Frederick Ozanam as his model of a lay apostle. And Frederick Ozanam had chosen to teach at a secular university rather than a Catholic institution because he wanted to bring that Christian message into a university that particularly at that time was very secularized and one probably in a lot of respects also rather anti-clerical. So his objective as a historian was to, again, play that reconciliation process of reconciling the study of history with the church and the history of the church. Of course, Ozanam, we also know him today for his work with the poor, but also on the question of social justice. And it's very significant that at the end of his life, Olle Laprune himself became known as a new Ozanam. So clear was his following in the footsteps of Ozanam that that's how he became known in the French Catholic circles towards the end of the 19th century. And it's interesting to look at again exactly how he understood the vocation that he derived from Ozanam. This is the writings of Olle Laprune himself. I will strive to do good in the world. I will strive to do good, A, by example, B, by influence, 3, by my words, and finally, in my writings. I take Ozanam to be my model. And as a student, at that time he was still a student, studying for his PhD equivalent, he wanted to act as a bridge between the church and that university, the university world, the academic world. He saw his task as to give witness to the Christian truth in the world of philosophy, which at that time in France was also very secularized, and the academic world. This was the kind of setting out of the life mission that Leon Olle Laprune took upon himself. It's interesting to see where he lived. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Paris. Some of you may know the Saint-Sulpice Church, which is just near the Luxembourg Gardens in the heart of Paris, near the left bank, just down from the Sorbonne. That is where Leon Olle Laprune lived. And we've got the address, 6 Place Saint-Sulpice. You can actually, well, it's a quick, I've taken it from Google Maps. It's not a very clear picture. Among the trees, you can see the building where he lived in one of the apartments. That's also a very significant location because it was also the site of the second, I believe it was the second conference of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, started there in 1835. And Olle Laprune himself was an active member of that conference. Another interesting person that lived there in the same building, as it turns out, was another very well-known social activist by the name of Frederick Laplay, all these people are linked together. It's amazing in Paris in that time. They're all got personal links with each other. And Frederick Laplay had studied with Guthrie. He became a mining engineer who was kind of shocked into action by the poverty that he discovered in the mining villages. And it turned him to the study of social problems. And he actually started a society to address those problems, the Société d'économie des sciences sociales, and a journal which went along with it. And they developed a method, which you'll very clearly recognize there, which became known as the method of social observation, based on 3 points: facts, principles, and solutions. So we see there the beginnings of what we now know today as the Gigacz. However, in the mind of Frederick Laplay, that method was addressed, and you can actually, I probably can't read the cover of that book that I've got there, but he specifically addressed it to the ruling classes. He saw it as being their role in a kind of renewal of medieval life. The rulers of society, it was their job to look after the people. So this was kind of what we consider today as a rather paternalist view. There was a second criticism made of Laplace's kind of approach, and that was that it was too sociological. There was no effort made to involve the people that were suffering from those problems. In effect, it was treating people like objects. So there were the critiques of the Laplace method. And again, Olle Laprune was extremely familiar with all this. So in a sense, what we see him doing is going further or endeavouring to go further than where Frederick Laplace had gone in his own work. And in 1875, this is where we get to the intellectual work and influence of Leon Olle Laprune. As we've mentioned, he became a lecturer. He went back, having been a student at the École Normale Supérieure, he went back as a lecturer. Here it's important, again, in that context of acting as a bridge between the university world and the church. You can see there at the date it was founded, the École Normale. It was founded in the middle of the French Revolution, and so extremely secular in the sense of being kind of anti-clerical. Initially, it was for training high school teachers. From 1848, it became a place for training future academics and government teachers, government officials. Very, very competitive, very difficult to get into. And Leon Olle Laprune, I think he was the first among the cohort that was entered into that year. Oh, some famous alumni from there. Emile Durkheim, you may be familiar with from the world of sociology. Charles Péguy, the author. Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone Weil, more recently, Foucault and Jacques Derrida. And in fact, amazing enough, 14 Nobel Prize winners from this school. So you can see how elite it was. And this is the environment into which young Leon Olle Laprune became a lecturer. But at the same time, he still hadn't finished his PhD when he actually began his teaching work there. So the first task that he had to undertake was, in fact, to finish his PhD. In those days, you wrote 2 theses for your doctorate in France, and the main one was on, the subject was La Certitude Morale. The objective was, or the subject was how do we know truth? A lot of the influence of John Henry Newman in France, very innovative in France. Olle Laprune was one of the first to bring the teaching of John Henry Newman into the French world. Complementary to that was another one on the foundation of Aristotelian ethics, and that was more about knowing how to live. So 2 very important aspects of life. How do we know the truth? How do we know how to live? They were the subjects of Leon Olle Laprune's PhD thesis, very controversial because he didn't separate his Christianity, his faith, from what he wrote about in philosophy. On the contrary, it's evident on every page. So this was a real no-no in the time. And in fact, they did his PhD defense in private for the fear of the controversy that it might cause. But this gives you an idea of the sort of person Olle Laprune was and what he intended to take into his teaching life. And he did. He wrote a series of books. Look, it's too hard to go through them. And there'll be another lecturer or more than one lecturer to go through them. But you can see the list of them there, very well known in the 19th century. He won prizes, became a very well-known academic philosopher at the time as a result of them. I will mention 2, maybe 3. One, again, as you see in 1881, is the French version of his PhD doctorate on study on Aristotle. The first one was in Latin, but then he translated into French for the more general public. That's very important for what we're going to be talking about today. And the second one is kind of his masterpiece, Le Prix de la Vie. In English, French in English can mean 2 things. It can mean the price or the prize. So I believe that's a deliberate double meaning there. It's the 2 sides of the coin, the price of life and the prize of life. And it went through 50 editions from 1894 until Second World War. So you can see a new edition every year. That's just amazing in any period for a book of philosophy, and shows you the influence that Olle Laprune had on those generations in France that were reading that book, which, of course, as we'll see, was in Cardijn's library and very important for him too. I'll mention one more, and that is the 1890 book there, 92 book, Le Source de la Paix Intellectuelle, in which he seeks to address the conflict of the time between the strong anti-clericalism of the time and the church that was the traditional authority in France. And we'll come back to the point of how he tried to bring peace, what he called intellectual peace, into that world. Yes, some of the famous students he had, I don't know if they're very well known outside of France, but they were exceedingly important people in the French world. Jean Jaurès became a co-founder of the Socialist Party in France, very, very important personality, but important in this context also because at that time, especially in general, the socialists were anti-clerical. But in fact, as it turns out, Olle Laprune had a great impact on Jean Jaurès, the co-founder of the French Socialist Party. Durkheim, I've mentioned before, pioneer sociologist, as many of us who've studied sociology will recognise. Henri Bergson, a famous French philosopher of the time, Nobel Prize winner for literature. So I don't know if you're familiar with him, but also another huge figure. And the one that's even more relevant in this particular context was a philosopher called Maurice Blondel, who, according to Yves Congar, the famous theologian of Vatican II, Congar regarded Maurice Blondel as the theologian of Vatican II. Blondel became famous for his own PhD thesis called L'action, action. So we can see there, there's very important idea of the time. How do we act in life? And actually, Blondel dedicated his PhD thesis to Olle Laprune, who'd been his teacher, as I say, in the École Normale Supérieure. So we see actually he's preparing the next generation that will follow him after his death in 1898. Now we come to the actual content of his teaching, and I've mentioned a couple of times already Aristotle. Aristotle's teaching on what is life about, how to live life. One important point to say here is one critique of Olle Laprune of Aristotle was that Aristotle didn't go far enough. In a sense, what Olle Laprune was trying to do was trying to integrate or complete Aristotle's work with Christianity, with how God fits into the whole picture. But in our context right here, right now, we're interested in what Aristotle said about how to live life and what Olle Laprune got from it. Now, here's what Olle Laprune writes about Aristotle. Practical reason discerns what is to be done in any situation. It takes account of times, places, and persons. It appreciates circumstances. It determines the conduct to be undertaken. These are practical definitions, not in view of science, but of action. This prudence or practical wisdom is not moral virtue, but it's the basis of it because it provides the light for it. It's necessary to think well in order to act. The man who knows much without acting well is less of a man than he who acts well without knowing much. So what do we do when we act well? When we practice acting well, this is how we develop moral virtue. And of course, he doesn't even see that as the total end. He sees for Olle Laprune, action is therefore greater than knowledge, although he also recognizes the ultimate is the contemplation of the eternal. But the important thing here, when we're speaking about life, is how action is even more important than knowledge. And how do we do that? How do we work out what action that we have to take? Prudential action, according to Olle Laprune, is based on freedom. It's not based on doing what somebody else tells us what to do, but based on us freely determining the thing that we need to do. And how do we determine that? This emerges from the analysis of the facts, and it's natural, therefore, to go further and judge, and finally to arrive at a conclusion. This is also in his book in 1881, A Nicomachean Ethics on Aristotle. We see the phrase emerging there, facts, judgment, conclusion, or decision, as he'll later say. Prudential action based on freedom. This is what Olle Laprune is teaching his students and which he'll continue to teach over the next 16, 17 years of his teaching life. He says, what does Aristotle propose to be the virtuous man, if not the development of the powers within him? And we see that we develop that by becoming conscious in the way we act, not just in a virtual manner, but looking, becoming aware instead of sleepily following others, raising our awareness, developing a real living conscious action. All this is very important in social life, says Olle Laprune, because it's in the middle of social life that the moral beauty of Aristotle's virtuous man bursts forth, particularly in the political sphere. So to become good political actors and also social actors, we need to learn how to see, to judge, and to conclude or decide. He went even further than that as a social activist. He was not just an intellectual or an academic, but he was also a social activist, and we can even call him a promoter of democracy in late 19th century France. He observed, this is in his book Le Prix de la Vie, he observed that history appears to be democratizing, not in the sense of leveling down, but in the real sense for Olle Laprune, in the sense of a personal effort to raise up minds and hearts. And how do we do that? We do that, here he says it again, we help people to become more capable of seeing clearly, judging and concluding. This is what he writes in 1896, just 2 or 3 years, or in fact almost at the time that Cardijn begins to read him. So we can see where Cardijn is picking up a very important idea of his life. Dare to see, dare to judge, dare to decide. We wouldn't speak properly today about acting in a virile manner, but in this context, at that time, he was speaking to Catholic university students who, sadly enough, at that time, were all male. But again, he saw that we could probably replace the word in a virile manner with courageous, is what he kind of really means. If we want to act courageously, again, he says we need to learn to see clearly, to judge, and thus arrive at decisions. This is what he's asking his students to do. Have the courage to see clearly, to judge, and to decide. 1896. Now, he's not alone in this. Doesn't just kind of go into the air. And I mean, people actually listen to him, and particularly at a college in Paris called the Stanislas College, where he'd been invited to give a talk in 1893 to the graduating students and the awards ceremony. Again, he teaches them to look directly at the things that are happening in society, the division especially that was happening. This is a way, in fact, in this speech, he's actually inviting people to use the see, judge, conclude method as a way of bringing peace among people, because we see together and we judge together. We don't just judge others, but we judge what's happening with others, in particular with those who don't agree with us. And that's the way in which he was telling those students that the solution to social problems could be found. Now, this college is very, very important in this story, because there's a young student there, 20 years old that year, Marc Sanier, who, if you've also heard other talks I've given, would later found a movement which became known as Le Sillon, or the Furrow. But just literally weeks after Olle Laprune gives his talk, Marc Sanier starts a study circle, very much based on the line that Olle Laprune had been speaking about. And you can see at the bottom of this page there, Marc Sanier kind of summarizes it later as what he calls a method of democratic education, in which they sought to teach young people who were going to become citizens, who are already citizens, to know the state of the country, especially when the situation was bad, look at the possible solutions, and finally to act. We can see very clearly there, between 1893 and 1898, this group, this study circle, initially known as the Crypt, later known as Le Sillon as a movement, they were implementing the method that today we know as the See, Judge, Act, directly following the influence, the inspiration of Léon Olle Laprune. Sadly, Léon Olle Laprune didn't live long enough to see the full flowering of that teaching. He died actually prematurely in February 1898, following a short illness, no antibiotics in those days. But it's very interesting to see how the Sion leaders acknowledged him, his life. As Albert Lamy, one of those leaders, said, his philosophy of life is our philosophy. Exactly. That's exactly the influence, I would almost say, the primary influence of Leon Olle Laprune's life. And as we'll see how that gets picked up, we'll see this. We now turn to his legacy. Yes, well, we don't have to go far to find his legacy. We come to 1925-26. I've just quoted a few things here from the original manual of the Belgian YCW, the girls' YCW, who are actually the first to articulate the method that we know today as the See, Judge and Act. And if we trace the links, we know directly how that Cardijn was influenced by Leon Olle Laprune and by the Sion. We see exactly how Cardijn had picked up what the Sion was doing and translated into his method of formation, lay apostolate formation for young workers. See, judge and act, leading to collective and organized action. And we see even the whole kind of prudential thing, attacking the problems of their life, addressing the problems of their life without fear or mockery, that courage of which Leon Olle Laprune. So we can see behind all that, the whole virtue ethics approach that Leon Olle Laprune had brought to the whole idea of the See and Judge and Act. And actually, Cardijn, we're not going to go through his whole life here. We're talking today about Leon Olle Laprune, but this is very significant because this is one of Cardijn's speeches at the Second Vatican Council, in which actually he was speaking about religious freedom, and in which he sees the need for religious freedom as the basis for internal liberty, by which people can become autonomous and responsible in society and before God, ready if necessary to obey God rather than people. And how do we develop that again? It's so close, what Cardijn says here, to the idea of Leon Olle Laprune. We develop the natural gift in every person through a long educational process that can be summarized in those words, see and judge and act. It's by showing confidence in young people, giving them the freedom to learn, to see and to judge and to act themselves, that they become actors themselves, agents, taking agency, to put a modern phrase around it, and also become adult witnesses of Christ and the gospel, conscious of being responsible for their sisters and brothers in the whole world. So we see there, I believe, the influence throughout the whole life in Cardijn's teaching, from the beginning of the YCW right through to the Second Vatican Council. And we can see that even further. I've covered it up a bit with the picture of John the 23rd, but we see that comes also into Catholic social teaching in Paris and practice in Mater and Magistra in 1961, which is the famous document which expresses the See, Judge, Act, look, judge and act, and incorporates it into Catholic social teaching. The part that's often forgotten here is the next paragraph, which speaks of the importance of this method and the need to practice it. It's not just something that we do in a kind of formulaic sort of a way. It's something that we learn by practicing it. Therefore, it becomes not something abstract, but something that must be translated into action. Again, the theory of prudential and virtuous action of Leon Olle Laprune. And we see this again in the actual definitive Vatican II documents. I won't go into detail here. You can read them for yourself, but in Apostolicam Actuositatem, See, Judge and Act again, the reference here to prudence, to virtue, learning how to act prudently in the light of faith, working and acting together, not just individually, but with others, so that we become Christian witnesses in our lives and in the world, as lay people in particular. And Gaudium and Spes in particular, if we're familiar with that, I won't go into the detail of this, but if you study the document, you'll see under that influence, it begins with the situation of people in the world. In fact, the whole document is kind of a double See, Judge, Act, beginning with the See, moving on to the judge, the dignity and the vocation of the human person. And then part two is kind of a huge act again on 5 chapters, each of which is an individual. If you look at it, it's very interesting to see each chapter is an individual see, judge, and act. And you can see that most clearly. Each chapter was written by a different working group, but in the chapter on culture, it's very clearly separated into 3 parts: see, judge, and act. So we see there that influence, which is we can trace back to Leon Olle Laprune over more than 70 years, right up to the end of Vatican II. And today, more recently, it's incorporated into Catholic social doctrine, the compendium of Catholic social doctrine, all there. The prudential, the virtue ethics basis of the whole method, studying reality, analysing and judging it in the light of God's plan, coming to a decision based on the steps, realistically taking on a sense of responsibility. And through that action, this is how we also develop our virtuous action and improve ourselves. And through to today, we see again the same thing with Pope Francis. I won't go to that. I think we're more familiar with it, but he repeated it very clearly last year when he met with the leaders of the French specialised Catholic action movements, including the YCW from France. And this also has been picked up in the whole movement for the Synod on Synodality by Sister Nathalie Beccard, who's one of the leaders of the Synod, the Undersecretary of the Synod, who stated it again just recently, I think it was earlier this year. We start from our situatedness, where we are. We start from the concrete reality in which we live. We try to interpret that in the light of the gospel to discern a course of action and to act. All that we can see, I believe, the influence of Olle Laprune over 70 years, which has become the teaching of the whole church today. And I think just to conclude, I just want to sort of show you the contrast between the ideas of Leon Olle Laprune and what became before him, and even some of the other ideas that are out there in the world today. I began by mentioning Frederick Laplay and his kind of scientific sociological method. Look, he was an absolute pioneer, Frederick Laplay, and under recognised, really ought to be kind of studied a lot more. He, in effect, what he tried to do was to apply scientific method to providing the solution to social problems. But he didn't really have the idea that the people themselves have to be involved in that process of change. Today, we see a similar idea. Sometimes it goes by the name of behaviour change. Sometimes people speak of behaviour change as people themselves changing themselves, but sometimes we see it as a kind of external thing. You know, this quote I've got here: behaviour modification is one method used to correct harmful behaviours, and it's centred on the concept of reusing reward and punishment to condition the patient out of the behaviour. This is the complete opposite of what Leon Olle Laprune's C-Judge Act approach is. This is treating people as objects, even if it's for a good purpose. We want them to get over their I don't know what, their drug addictions or whatever the problem might be. But this is using external influences, almost electrical shocks, to convince people or to get people to change their ways. Leon Olle Laprune's method is the complete opposite, starting from the people themselves, developing them through that process of learning to see and to judge and to act, which develops themselves as people of virtue. So this whole method of Leon Olle Laprune is what today we could call faith-inspired virtue ethics. It's not taught in Australia, in Catholic universities, certainly not in Australian Catholic universities. I don't even know of any international Catholic universities which teach it, but that is where it comes from. It's amazing to me that our Catholic universities don't teach it, and this is also why I think it's very important for us to know it. It's not necessary for young maybe leaders in the YCW, 18 years old, starting out, but if we are working with YCW groups or with youth groups or even with any kind of parish groups who try to use the C-Judge Act method, I think this is incredibly important for us to understand. This is not just a method of solving problems, this is a method of formation of people. And from that also, it's very much linked to Leon Olle Laprune's conception of lay apostolate, as I mentioned it right at the beginning, his inspiration from Frederick Ozanam. So my concluding word, I'd just like to say, I used to call Leon Olle Laprune the philosopher of the C-Judge Act. Today, I'd like to add, I see him as the philosopher of the lay apostolate, and also I will dare to say it, as the philosopher of Vatican II. Thank you very much. Yeah, well, you probably need a break after all that. Yeah. Over to you, Pat.
Okay. Thank you very much, Stefan. I think you're still sharing the screen with us. If we can turn that off, it would be great. Brilliant. Okay. Boy, and before dinner in my part of the world too, a real feast. Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's over to us now to share with Stefan any reflections that we might have on what he said, any questions that we might have that we want to put to him in order to have some things clarified for us.
I've got a question.
Yes.
Or a comment. I notice very much the See, Judge and Act is very much a reflection, very similar to Jesuit spirituality, where Ignatius talks about discerning spirits, where he asks people to be aware of what movements are happening within them, to understand those movements, and then to accept or reject them. And it seems that's exactly what See, Judge and Act is.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting comment. There's no doubt, there's kind of a strong overlap there. And this also explains, to some extent, you could say Pope Francis's interest in the whole issue, and sometimes also the way he in fact replaces the word judge with discern. And it's very interesting to see that in the early days of the YCW, some of Cardine's earliest collaborators were in fact Jesuits. His adjunct in 1925, I actually think he was one of the first persons to write about the See, Judge, Act in a systematic way, was in fact a Belgian Jesuit, Joseph Arendt. And if you look in Belgium, the 1920s, 1930s, many of Cardine's key collaborators, the whole Jesuit community of Belgium were very close allies, and in fact became kind of some of the people who helped to transmit the YCW around the world. For example, countries like India and that. So yes, there's a very strong overlap. I'm not an expert in Jesuit spirituality, but definitely it's a strong overlap there. Yeah. Oh, it's interesting. There's another Jesuit too. Oh, now I'm going to forget his name. The Canadian. What's that Canadian name? I'll remember in a minute. But he's dead now, but he became famous also because he kind of wrote a philosophy which also kind of draws largely on the See, Judge, Act. Anybody remember Lonergan? Yeah, there you go. David's got it in the chat. Bernard Lonergan. Yeah, Canadian philosopher. Yeah, very important, Bernard Lonergan. And again, I was speaking to people from Boston College just recently where they've got the archives of Bernard Lonergan, and they know there's a link between Lonergan and Cardijn, or between the See, Judge, Act, but nobody's studied it yet. So there's a lot of things out there for, well, doesn't look like there's a lot of future PhD students among our audience tonight. But anyway, if you know any, there's just a lot of things can be picked up on there. Yeah.
Stefan, Sister Lee Tan has asked the following question in the chat. What was the situation of the Catholic Church at that time? How did the church hierarchy react to See, Judge, Act when this approach was first mentioned?
That is another very interesting question. Yeah, well, I did mention how the critique of Frederick Laplay's method as being a very sociological method. And in the beginning, people couldn't distinguish between what Laplay was doing, that sociological method, and what the Sion was doing, which was the virtue ethics-based method. So there was a lot of criticism it's one of the reasons there was a lot of criticism of the Sillon in France, because they, as I say, they were kind of pioneered. They didn't call it the Cardijn, but they pioneered this method starting from life, not starting from church doctrine, but starting from life. And there was a huge amount of criticism. And we see that criticism in Belgium as well. Weirdly enough, it also came from the conservative members of the Jesuit community in France. There was one Belgian Jesuit in 1926 published a book called Doctrine First. And he didn't mention the Cardijn, but it's a very clear attack on the emerging Cardijn. And what he's saying is, we don't start with reality, we start with what the church teaches, with church doctrine. And this was an argument which has gone through the church from that time. Already we said in the 1880s, it was there in the time of the Sillon, it was there in the time of the early YCW. And actually, I don't know if people here are familiar with Cardijn's three truths approach. In fact, again, there's no time to discuss that today, but in fact, the three truths was Cardijn's response to that question. Because when he talked about the three truths, he talked about the truth of faith. So therefore, that was giving a direct response to those people who were kind of criticizing the YCW and saying it wasn't faith-based enough. I haven't got time to go into the detail of that. But that argument, and that came right through the Vatican II in the drafting of Gaudium et Spes. Initially, there was a lot of opposition to that idea of starting with the facts. If you read Gaudium et Spes, if you look at that section called the situation of the world, the situation of people, it's the introduction. And you might ask yourself the question, if they're following the Cardijn, why isn't that part one? And actually, there's a very good political reason for that. And that is that there was many council fathers that were not comfortable with the idea of the Cardijn being the basis of a council document. They actually said, Cardijn is okay for lay people, but not for us bishops. Us bishops, we're about church doctrine. So it was kind of literally, they literally said that. And so it was a kind of compromise that they reached. They said, well, okay, we won't call it part one. We'll put the reality in the introduction, and that way we'll be starting the real document with the doctrine of the church. That was the compromise that they reached in the drafting of Gaudium et Spes. But if you look at the whole document without thinking about why it's called the introduction, it's so clear. And in fact, we know the key drafter of Gaudium et Spes was a guy called Pierre Hultmann, who'd been a YCW chaplain. He'd been a chaplain of a whole series of specialized Catholic action movements in France. And it was the French bishops that wanted him, that kind of made him to be lobbied for him to become the chief redactor of the last version. And there's just no doubt that's why they chose him, because he was an expert in that field. He knew the Cardijn. He'd been practicing it since the 1930s. And he was an intellectual as well. He became director of the Catholic Institute of Paris, which gives you an indication of the level of his academic prowess as well. So yeah, that thing's been there all along. We still hear echoes of it in Australia from our Archbishop of Sydney, who's sometimes made exactly the same criticism of the Cardijn, allegedly being too sociological. Well, it's true. You know, you can take the Cardijn as a purely sociological method. But this is also why it's important to look at how Olle Laprune understood it and what the origin of it is. And yeah, there you go. Another talk as my answer.
Do we have any further questions?
Stefan,
Yes,
Des here.
Yep.
I just checked the dates on the French Revolution, was 1789 to 1799. Do you think that had any influence in the writings that we've been talking about tonight?
Yes, absolutely. Because, we know there were so many kind of Catholic martyrs of the French Revolution. Mm. Weirdly enough, actually, if you look at the beginnings of the French Revolution, in fact, a lot of people say, they might say it more recently, there was a lot of Catholic inspiration in the beginnings of the French Revolution, the idea of equality, liberty, equality, fraternity. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I have to go back to study this point, but originally they talked about liberty and equality, and it was through Christian influence that they added the word fraternity, you know, to the whole phrase, liberty, equality, fraternity. But, you know, it was very ambiguous and conflictual, obviously. You know, so many people were killed, martyred. And this whole conflict lasted through for more than, even up to today in France. People still want to restore, you know, the King of France. But this was still very strong at the end of the 19th century. And actually, Pope Leon XIII, we know him because he wrote Rerum Novarum about the situation of workers in 1891. In 1892, he wrote another encyclical specifically addressed to the French, in which he, in kind of colloquial terms, he said to the French, stop dreaming of bringing back the king and get used to the fact that you're now living in a republic and be Christians in that republic. And that's exactly the idea that the Sion took up. Okay, we're living in a democracy now. We've got to make that democracy work. We've got to bring our Christianity into that democracy. And that was very much Leon Olle Laprune's idea. That was the idea of Ozanam, again, bridging that gap between the secular or the anti-clerical 19th century world and the beliefs and faith of the church. So yeah, very important for Leon Olle Laprune. Yep, that's what he was trying to do. He was trying to be a bridge between that anti-clerical, anti-religious world and the church.
Thank you for that. I just wondered, what you've just said, how does the hierarchical structure of the church fit?
Yeah, well, this is very interesting as well, you know, and probably a point for discussion. But look, I think the most interesting aspect of that is, I mentioned at the start, like Sister Natalie Beccard, who's the secretary of the Synod on Synodality, it's been taken up as a method of work for the Synod. So, you know, kind of, you can, Leon Olle Laprune almost said it in his own words, but not in today's words. But, you know, like they were taking it up in the context of citizenship, you know, okay, in a democracy, we teach people to be citizens by teaching them, enabling them to learn how to see and to judge and to act. Well, in a sense, that's what's happening in the church now, you know, baptism, we're all baptized. Everything doesn't descend from the hierarchy. And how do we do that? You know, by the same process of learning to see and learning to judge and learning to act. And I mean, that's what they say kind of at the Synod, in fact, you know, but I'm not sure if it's actually penetrated kind of around the whole world of the church. And I mean, there's kind of a contradiction there, you know, like why has the YCW, for example, and the Specialized Catholic Action Movements been neglected by the church as they have around the world, you know, specifically at the time when the church is speaking about synodality, you know? I mean, the See Judge Act, I'm not saying it's exclusively the only way of doing it, becoming a synodal church, but it's extremely important because it's addressed to people as individuals, learning to take responsibility in their lives, including the church. So yeah, extremely relevant. Anybody else feel ready to jump in? Go for it. Yeah. Yeah, we don't have to keep going. We've been going for a while. So, Pat, is there anybody else that's got any questions?
No.
Oh, Ashish is there. Ashish, I see.
Yes.
Go for it, Ashish.
Yeah, Stephen, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I think it was really good to see how that progressed in terms of, you know, wordings and how we are now using that methodology as forming leaders. Just to give you context in terms of YCW and the young people, I'm not sure, but if you look into the census of last year, that there are so many people who are turning towards saying that they are second highest religion of Australia being the no religion. There are so many young students who are actually not following Christianity or Catholicism after they school, you know, leave the, you know, Catholic school. There is so many young people who are actually considering themselves to be more spiritual rather than being kind of like mentioned as a religious person. And there is also another context in terms of when you're working with the young people, the word judge has a different connotation. They are like, you might have, if you interact with young people today, then they would say, why do I need to judge, and other things. We understand the importance of the methodology. We understand the spirituality of methodology. And I think in one of your presentation, there was a line where it said the process actually, it elevates or raises your mind and your heart. And I think that's beautifully described, what the process is all about. In your words, because from YCW as a movement, we always try and use the methodology. We always use the methodology, but we always see that some people kind of like fail to articulate what it means, why sees as an act is so important in life, what transformation it can bring in your life. That's a bigger question people are asking. And I'm kind of like seeing that we don't have like a really good resource, which is more young people friendly, to communicate with them in terms of what it means, why to use this methodology as a life-changing method. So I'm just wanted to ask, in terms of ACI, do you have any resources which is more young people friendly? Again, because the attention time span has gone so low with young people. So how can we make the methodology so I would say relevant to the young people, so we can invite more young people to follow this and then kind of like help them in this path of understanding themselves and then being a better citizen in the world in the light of their belief.
Yes, very interesting. Well, two questions really, and both extremely interesting. Look, I totally agree with what you're saying, especially about like the context in many countries now of secularization. Young people have no religion, so therefore, why are they going to want to read the gospel? Well, I think we can go back to Aristotle here. Aristotle didn't speak about, obviously, the gospel because he was before the gospel. But before being a Christian method, it's a human method. This is how humans, learn to see, learn to judge or discern, if we prefer to use that word, or think of another word, and to act. So I think it's not just, it's very important. Even Olle Laprune said it himself. We start where people are. And this is also what Cardijn said so many times. We start where people are. So, we're not a preaching organization. We start where people are, with what's important to them in their life, in the words that they speak. And Sister Natalie said the same thing. We start with the situatedness of people. That's what that's what she means. We start with people are. Where I'm living here in Lille, most of the young people are Muslim because they're families from North Africa. You're not going to start a YCW group kind of with the gospel, And when I worked in Asia, actually, I did some experiments, but I wish I went further. We ran a program called Young People for Development there, with young people from various Asian countries, from Bangladesh, Muslim, from Nepal, Hindu, from Cambodia, Buddhist. So actually, I did. Actually, did very simple C-Judge Act on friendship. It was an exercise for the formation program. So I specifically went to look for texts from the Buddhist teaching, from Buddha about friendship. I looked for Muslim texts, from the Quran about friendship. I looked for some Hindu context statement about friendship. So I think it's not that hard to do, but I agree it's a lot of work to do it. And I totally agree with you. There's a need for resources addressed to young people. Well, look, if you want to, I don't know how we do it because you're the people in touch with the young people, but I'm sure as ACI, look, you see, where most of us are not so young anymore, or 3 times young or 4 times young. But, if we can find a way of cooperating with you on the development of those resources, speaking to young people, I think it's really important, And I think that's why I think it's important to understand Olle Laprune and Aristotle, to understand the intellectual basis of it. Because it's like when you know the theory of the thing, then you can adjust it, We don't have to say see, judge, act, If young people don't like the word judge, well, pick another word. Say discern, if that's the word for today, But the important thing is we know, well, what's what is the theory behind it? What are we trying to do? And yeah, we try to, it's weird. It's weird, like even see Gigacz, I mean, they were words that spoke to people at the time, the late 19th century, the early 20th century. We don't have to exactly use the same words now. In the USA, they never even called it the see Gigacz. They called it observe Gigacz, even Pope John Paul II, he wrote an encyclical, and I think he actually used the phrase think Gigacz. So there's lots of ways to say it. And I think that, we have to contextualize it and situate it, let's say, in the way that's what Sister Natalie says. Yeah.
David posted a comment and a question in the chat.
The bottom up, Olle Laprune, about collective and organised action. Well, I mean, what Olle Laprune was when he was speaking to those students at Stanislas College, he was directly saying to them, in his own words, I'm kind of rephrasing it a bit, but what he was saying to those students was, you need to come together. I mean, definitely, look, everything I've said now, it's got to start from the individual. Individually, we've got to learn that. That's how we become better people. We learn to act by acting. So, it's got to start with the individual. But the same thing applies at a collective level too, and especially in a divided, not necessarily even divided society, but in a multicultural society where people have got different starting points, we've got to bring them together. So we've got to do that at every level. We've got to bring them together in the seeing and in the judging and in the acting. This is how we build, as Leon Olle Laprune said, this is how we build social peace. So I'm not sure what David's point is about the Cultural Revolution. But I mean, yeah, I know today, even in the church, everything's kind of top down, even the way synodality, it's a danger. It's been co-opted, all the big church organizations are involved. Where are the grassroots groups of the church involved in this whole synodality thing? It's a big problem. It's a big question. But yeah, that's the challenge. David, maybe you want to speak to it. I don't know. That's what I've got. That's my kind of interpretation.
No, that's fine.
Yeah. Yep. Well, anyway, look, I don't want to, we've been going a while. I can go all night, but I see we've been going for a while. So I also feel like maybe people want to rest or need to go and have that dinner. So, Pat, is there anybody else that wants to jump in? Last comments?
Good value, Stefan.
Thanks, Father Ron. Yeah,
Very good.
next challenge, let's try and get this into ACU and to University of Notre Dame. This stuff ought to be taught there. I mean, they even say they're teaching virtue ethics there. Why are they not teaching this? Another challenge and question. Amen. Thank you all very much.
Okay. Thank you, Stefan.
Great.
Stefan, thanks a lot.
All right.